Thank you for staying with us. Now, today being Labor Day, workers would ordinarily gather together not only to celebrate their input to the economy, but also listen to an announcement, hopefully from the government, with hope of an increase in minimum wages. However, this year's celebration was different. There was a very minimal gathering at State House, and for some workers, they are staring at job losses or salary cuts as the effects of COVID-19 pandemic are felt. Tonight, we seek answers on the way forward for Kenyan employees and employers. And I'm speaking to Federation of Kenya Employers Executive Director, Jacqueline Mugo. Good evening, Jacqueline. Good evening.
Good evening to you, Lillian.
Very good to have you on the show, Jacqueline. Listening into the president's conversation today, or rather what he was saying earlier at State House, he mentioned that we're looking at the possibility of losing about 500,000 jobs, of persons losing 500,000 jobs if this situation is not controlled. Atwoli also speaking about arbitrary and merciless pay cuts. So borrowing from what was said today during the Labor Day proceedings at State House, what can the government do, in your opinion, to prevent far-reaching actions being taken by employers? I'm talking about pay cuts, I'm talking about job losses, in some incidents, even retrenchments. What is the way forward?
First, let me start by wishing all Kenyans a happy Labor Day, although it's evening, and to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused untold challenges and problems to the economy and also to the health and lives of our people. The government moved in immediately, I think, to do what was expected and what was right in terms of protecting lives and reducing the levels of infection, which it is doing a good job in doing, and we Kenyans also ought to do what we can to support the government and do what's being said. But the reality is that COVID-19 is a health crisis, it's a labor crisis, it's an employment crisis, and ultimately a social crisis. So what the government has done in response, by and large, to requests and appeals and proposals from employers and the private sector at large was ways of cushioning both industry and workers. And there were tax rebates and incentives that were given. The banks have offered the possibility of renegotiating loans. There is focus on the SME sector, and those measures are highly appreciated by employers. But the reality is that they're not sufficient, and we still are at great risk of losing jobs. And so what needs to happen is for the government to do more, and also for employers to be supported, because at the end of the day, jobs come from enterprises, whether they're in the formal or the informal economy. The bulk of those jobs actually come from the informal economy, but the formal sector pays taxes that runs government. So we've been saying that we need to have measures to cushion both industry and workers. The conversation seems to be leaning a lot towards employees and how to safeguard them and not to terminate them from employment. But for an enterprise to keep people in jobs, it has to be viable and functioning. So I think more needs to be done in terms of long-term support to industry to be able to protect jobs. And unfortunately, the 500,000 jobs the president was talking about may actually be higher than that actual number if you listen to what's happening in key sectors like hospitality and tourism and travel, transport sectors.
Right. Jacqueline, you say that the government needs to do more. Listening in to Francis Atwoli today, he spoke about arbitrary and merciless pay cuts, and those were his words, quote, end quote. Seeing that this pandemic has affected both the employer and the employee, talk of resolutions perhaps which will guide the employee and the employer during this period. We're seeing employers being taken to court by persons who don't understand why they have to take such extreme pay cuts. Employees also not understanding in some instances why they have to work from home on half pay. So what would be the in-between in terms of the relation between the employer and the employee as we look for a solution?
I think you put it rightly that any action taken has to be in between. It has to be balanced. addressing both the employee and the employer's issues. And I must say that from the beginning, when the pandemic descended on us, our advice as FKE to employers was that we see how to protect jobs. And there is no enterprise that has rushed into dismissing people from employment. And what we did was to send people on leave. But the leave provisions that most companies have either now been exhausted or will be exhausted at the end of, were exhausted at the end of April. As we head into May, now businesses are looking at unpaid leave. But yesterday, we did something unusual in terms of employers and COTU and the Ministry of Labor, and that was to sign what we are calling a framework agreement or a memorandum of understanding that seeks to have this balanced approach in terms of looking at options that are open to us to address employee issues and also protect enterprises. So there are a raft of options that are contained in that agreement that emphasizes on dialogue, on social dialogue, on which this sector is founded. The labor sector is founded on social dialogue. So companies are open to coming together and discussing with their unions where there is one, where there's no union, then talking with their employees to look at the possibilities of leave, where the normal leave is exhausted, looking at unpaid leave, looking at pay cuts and other options so that at the end of the day we can protect jobs. But if the COVID-19 persists up to June, which was the initial projection, then we must also consider the fact that companies cannot pay salaries for work that is not being done, because you pay for work done normally and for outcomes and deliverables and profits that are made by the enterprise. If that's not happening, then what we've been telling government is that we needed as a country to have had some social protection measures that would have wage subsidies for situations such as this.
Mm-hmm. All right, well said. Now, on Labor Day, Jacqueline, Kenyans are always looking forward to news on increase in minimum wage, and we are certainly hoping that this pandemic will be over in the time frame that it was expected to at least be put under control or to be manageable. Under the current situation where the economy is currently taking a beating, how does that in turn affect minimum wage improvement in this period, even as we look forward to a slightly better next couple of months or for employers or for employees in terms of minimum wage, which employees hope should improve every other Labor Day? What are we expecting to see under the current economic situation in the country and in the world?
You know, for many years, employers have been trying to appeal to the unions not to look at Labor Day as a day for increasing minimum wages. Unfortunately, that's the rhetoric that we have entrenched into our system here. And we have in the past agreed that we'd have these discussions on wage adjustments away from Labor Day so we can celebrate work on Labor Days itself, which is what it's supposed to be. This year, of course, circumstances have dictated that that cannot even be a discussion on the table. Fortunately, the government had taken some action and released those who are at the lowest end of the pay scale, those earning up to 24,000 shillings from paying tax. So that has removed that burden, because those who are on the minimum wage actually earn salaries below 20,000. It's about 15,000. And there are very few Kenyans in formal employment who earn those kinds of monies. That's for casual workers and piece rate workers. But I think long term, we need to come up with a wage policy as a country that addresses matters of wage determination and wage adjustments in a rational manner that looks at all the statistics, the figures, the factors of wage determination away from the pressure of Labor Day. For this year, it was made very clear that that was not possible. We will be having matters of discussing really how to sustain people in jobs, not salary increases, and that even the union recognizes that we cannot talk about salary increases, perhaps for the balance of this year, because even if we are through with the highest crisis, the highest level of infections, and we're able to contain that and see a flattening of the curve, the reality is that most of 2020 will be on recovery. So going into 2021, we hope to have these conversations that look at our current wage levels and see how to adjust them. But if you look at the region, Kenya has the highest minimum wages, to be honest. So that already makes us a little less competitive than the rest of the countries in our region.
We are winding up our conversation. Jacqueline, I just want to read out some feedback from one viewer here. And this is one out of the many that people are sending in. And Engineer Lazaro Kanyambok says, Kenya is known to be among the African nations with weak labor laws. Are you in agreement? Do you think that employees would have been cushioned better had the country had stronger or more effective labor laws?
Actually, the Kenyan labor laws are amongst the most advanced laws in Africa. They were reviewed in the year 2007 based on some of the most advanced ideas and ideals. They are hugely protective towards the employee. It's very, very difficult for an employer under the current laws to take any action against any employees, and employers find those laws very restrictive, and they protect the employee by and large. And actually what we need to do now is not to make those laws tighter. Currently, Parliament is proposing to pass laws and Senate that make it impossible for an employer to manage the enterprise or to release employees from work. Those decisions in times of crisis such as this should be left to dialogue between the parties, between employers and unions, between employers and their workers, so that they can agree on options that are particular to that enterprise and address their needs. So our laws are fine. If anything, they're very restrictive. What we need to do is look at this scenario, not in terms of laws and legislation. It's a social problem. So it cannot be handled through legislation. It needs to be handled through dialogue and accommodation and a rational approach, which is what is contained in the agreement that was signed yesterday by the social partners.
I thank you very much for your time tonight. I've been speaking to Jacqueline Mugo. Her parting shot: this is a social problem that can be best handled by dialogue. She is the Federation of Kenya Employers Executive Director. And this being Labor Day, our conversation revolving around how to cushion employers and employees during this corona pandemic period.